is tech. And tech, I mean, everyone knows tech moves at like an incredible pace and it's improved. And if you start thinking about what could you do on your phone today that you couldn't do 10 years ago, it's quite easy to see what I mean, right? But actually, the reason why tech is shifting at this pace is something called Moore's law. And some of us may be familiar with it, some of us may not be. But what Moore's law says is that every couple of years, you're going to see a doubling of processing power and a halving of cost. And that's what's driving technology to be better and cheaper and faster. And so if you think about TVs, you can buy TVs for double the size and half the cost than you could 10 years ago. And you know, the same thing with sort of other electronics. And what that means for data is that the cost of a gigabyte of data has fallen from $200,000 for 1 gigabyte in 1980 to less than half a cent today. And so, you know, what does that enable in terms of just, you know, the types of things you can do with your phone? It's pretty incredible. And if you think about what that means in terms of something else that we all understand, if that had happened, if that sort of pace of change had happened in the property market, you could buy all the property in the world, so $240 trillion worth of property for just over $4 million. So that's kind of what it's doing, right, in terms of data and technology. And what that means is that suddenly everything can be a tech business. Health can be a tech business. Education can be tech enabled. Like agriculture can be tech enabled. It just means that all of our worlds are now going to be increasingly more tech connected. And I think that's a big opportunity for us. So if we go to the next slide, is really about another trend that many of you will be familiar with because you're digital natives. But you know, for people who grew up in sort of 70s and 80s like me, I was really used to growing up in a centralized world, right, where governments and corporations ran things, and the rest of us just kind of fit into that. And actually, sorry, I think someone's not on mute. I'm muted too. There we go. So yeah, so decentralization has become a massive driver of change in the world. And one of the things I say is when you want to look for where innovation is happening in the world, start with the criminals, right? So in the sort of 90s and 2000s, we started seeing terror networks move away from being centralized to decentralized, wildlife traffickers move away from being centralized to decentralized, because what does that give them? It gives them agility in a world that is centralized. So police sort of organizations are quite centralized, governments are quite centralized. And so if you're decentralized in a centralized world, it actually gives you a lot more agility to move through. And so what the criminals started has actually become mainstream in many parts of the world now. So, you know, if you think about One Young World, it's a very decentralized network. It's framed by this concept of this One Young World family, but actually it's very decentralized. It's done at a local level, and it's done sort of with meaning in impact in the societies that you live in. You know, crypto is decentralized, and it's really becoming mainstream. NFTs, you know, if you look at what's happening with stocks, we're moving away from exchanges to all these really interesting apps and ways of sort of investing in private companies and public companies that we've never had before. We're seeing, you know, countries move away from being centralized to decentralized. You look at the power of states in the United States, you know, more and more the federal government is becoming less powerful and the states are becoming more powerful. And then you see in the world, in terms of global trade patterns, it's moved away from being the West against the East to actually now being much more about individual states contracting with each other for trade agreements. And so decentralization is a massive shift that's happening in our world. And it's going to help, again, everything that we do, because decentralization naturally empowers people. And I think that's quite a big shift. And then if we go to the next slide, the third massive shift that I see, and you guys are living proof of it, is this idea of, you know, Generation C. It's like the millennials, Gen Z, everyone is Generation C. It's generation connected. And the idea of the connected generation is everything becomes about sharing and social, right? So you don't want to own assets anymore. You want to lease assets. You think about Uber and Airbnb. Those are sort of good examples of sharing economy. You also look at sort of, you know, the fact that actually people are now saying, I want a gig. I don't want just a job. I want a gig. And so most people in the workforce, I think it's over 50% of people in the workforce today have a side gig. And so what does that mean? It means that actually people are saying, I want to bring my whole self to work, and I want to actually be connected to the things that matter to me. And I want to make sure that the company that I work for recognizes that those things matter to me. And if you look at what impact that's having on corporates, Goldman Sachs, I don't know, if you told me 15 years ago that Goldman Sachs would be at the forefront of crypto and social, I would have probably not believed you. And the reason they are, 70% of their staff are now millennials. And so you think about what that does to a company, it completely changes the DNA of an organization. And so, some of you may be in organizations that aren't there yet. And I know it sometimes feels like you're pushing hard against something that's just not willing to move. Just realize that this is a movement. This isn't something that people can resist. It's a massive wave. And any company that's standing in its way is not going to be left standing. Right. And if you think about what that means for you, it means you are the future of the world, and you're now that future. You're already at the forefront of social change. You're already at the forefront of this trend. And so, this is a really, really powerful trend. And I don't think anyone should underestimate their place in it. So what does that mean for kind of our world? Let's go to the next slide. And the next slide is really an intersection point. And for me, this is where societal shift happens. It happens not because of one shift or two shifts or three shifts. It's when they converge and they start meeting. And that's what you're starting to see now with sort of how our world is shifting. So you're starting to see that companies who understand what decentralization and social and sharing and connection and sort of the whole power of how the world has moved into much cheaper tech, the companies that are leaning into that are doing incredibly well. And they're becoming unicorns. And so you hear this term being bandied around of unicorns, but those are the companies that are really, really doing well. So I think, again, Salesforce, Netflix, Uber, Airbnb, think about all these companies, Coinbase, just recently listed, they're also playing into this trend. And so those companies will do 10 times better than their peers on average. But also what it means is that 30% of today's Fortune 1000 will be obsolete in 10 years. So think about what that means, right? Like there's a lot of companies that just aren't getting these trends and aren't able to come along, and they're not going to be around in 10 years. And so, either they're going to wake up or they're not, and we won't know these brands anymore. And so what does it mean for you as a young leader? It means that you want to be either helping those companies that are going to become obsolete, not become obsolete, to stay relevant, or you're going to be working with one of these companies that is already on the path, that is thinking 10x, that is thinking about their impact on the world, and how they have it, and you're going to be helping them. And so, how do you do that? And I think a lot of people sort of say, oh, I totally get that, but how do I do that? Well, let's go to the next slide. And I think, Gandhi had a really interesting way of looking at change, where he said, be the change that you want to see in the world. And for me, what that means is start with yourself. If you don't start with yourself, you can't change anybody else. And that's true in your personal relationships. It's true with your work. It's true with anything that you do. You actually can't change the world unless you change yourself. So the first thing you need to do is worry less about having a bigger megaphone, which is, I think, what a lot of young people think in sort of now coming into change. They're like, I just need a bigger platform. I just need someone to hear my voice. Actually, you don't need a bigger megaphone. You need a bigger mirror, right? You need a better mirror that you can look at yourself and say, am I centered? Do I understand my own values? Do I understand why this matters so much for me? Do I understand my place in the world? Do I understand how I want to grow through this? Am I willing to change the things in myself that are holding me back from achieving that? And I think that's the first thing. And then the second thing, once you've got that, is actually to figure out, I don't need a megaphone, but I need to have a voice that has impact. And a voice that has impact, Nelson Mandela, who I absolutely adore and I think is one of the most incredible leaders, not just because he is purposeful and inspirational, but because he was one of the most pragmatic negotiators that you will see in sort of global leadership. And a phrase he used often was, if you speak to someone if you speak to someone in a language they understand, you speak to their head. And if you speak to them in their language, you speak to their heart. And I see many young change makers make this mistake, right? You go and rail against the authority and say, you need to change this because the world has shifted and I need you to change this. And often the person in authority is speaking a completely different language and they don't understand what you're saying. So even though you're right, you're not effective. And so the way to change that is you speak in your voice. So don't change your voice, right? Your voice is your voice. The things that you're passionate about, don't change those, don't dim those, but speak in the language that they speak, they understand. Because, if you're speaking, for example, to CFO, and I've had many times to try and change my CFO's thinking around purpose, right? Because they're all thinking about margin. And the only way to speak to them in a way that they will understand about purpose is to speak about margin. You have to talk about how the purpose will change the margin, right? The same way, if you're trying to get your CEO to sort of become, carbon neutral, the only way you're going to speak to them in a way that they understand is to speak to them about customers and revenue and growth and investors, right? Like that's the language they speak. And so speak in your voice, but speak in their language. And I can't stress that. It's, if you take nothing away from this, this is the one point. If you want to be 10 times more effective, this is the thing to do. The second thing I would say, if we go to the next slide, is lean into the power of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is going to be the answer for most problems in our world. You talk about the SDGs, you talk about, anything, whether it's climate change, whether it's gender equality, whether it's human rights. There are entrepreneurs out there that are really solving for that. And 1 million jobs, if we create 1 million jobs in a specific sector, it will make a dent, right? It'll make a dent into how you can impact that sector. If you create 1 million entrepreneurs trying to solve problems in that sector, you will change the world. And so, I know many of you know this, and I know many of you already have side businesses that you're trying to scale, but this is Mandy's point too about charities are great, but you spend a lot of time fundraising. If you really want to change the world, you need to have a social business. And there are so many right now. This is the era of social businesses. I mean, you literally can't look around without tripping on one. I know so many social entrepreneurs in Africa that in this last year, because there's so much money sitting on the sidelines in the global economy, are just getting money pumped into them. There's an incredible entrepreneur in South Africa called Lula Loop, who's trying to create this idea of Uber, but for public transport in South Africa in a very sustainable way, really doing an incredible job. And they've just raised a really nice amount of funding. There's a company in the US called Kahawa 1893 that basically it's a Kenyan lady, but what she does is when you buy a coffee in the United States, you buy the packet, and on the back of the packet is a QR code. And through that, you can actually tip the farmer that made your coffee. And so suddenly, closing the gap between, the consumer of the coffee and the producer of the coffee, which is, I think, incredible. There's a lady I know who runs an organization called WomHub in South Africa that's creating hubs for women founders across the continent, as well as female-led investment funding into entrepreneurs in Africa. There's a company I know called Chanson International that's based in Rwanda that is finding new models to finance education that's all based on income share agreements, so that you don't have to pay anything as a student, but actually as you make money, you'll pay back the money. And so there are some really incredible entrepreneurs. Lean into them and be part of that network, because you will go much, much further. And then the third and final point before we sort of open up for Q&A is really, and I love this last slide. So if we just move to that, this has actually a photo that was taken by one of our Reuters photographers in South Africa. And it's of a mural in Cape Town, and it's made up of people's hands, right? And the hands make the beautiful picture. And so, in Africa, there's a saying that actually, if you want to go fast, go alone. And if you want to go further, you want to go together. And this is so true. We have far to go. We're not trying to make small, quick wins. We're trying to make long-lasting change. And therefore, going together is really important. And this is one of the things, the pandemic last year brought a connection across different parts of the world. The fact that we have people from Ireland and South Africa on this call is a good example. There is now a way to connect with somebody who's doing the same thing that you are trying to do on the other side of the world. There's a way to connect and do things that there wasn't 10 years ago. And so, lean into that, leverage the fact that there are experts on demand in a way that there's never been before. There's now services like GuidePoint is an example of a service like this, where you can actually get an AI expert or an ESG expert for an hour to talk to you about, what's actually going on in their world. And we've never been able to have this much access. You used to have to pay McKinsey for that kind of stuff before. And so suddenly you've got so much access to people who can help you further your cause. So go together. And my final point is just be ambitious. Like, I think one of the things that Mandela has really taught the world is that South Africa was really a beacon for the rest of the world, not just for itself, but as to how a country in so much conflict could recognize its own conflict and come together and work on it. And so, we're going to be now in a time of the greatest wealth creation and the greatest wealth destruction in history. And I'll say that again, just because it's really important. We are in the time of the greatest wealth creation and wealth destruction in history. And it's our job to make sure that that wealth creation is actually equal, because right now the trend is moving away from us and it's not good. And so, as a change maker, be ambitious. Another quote by Mandela that I really love is, there is no passion to be found in playing small, in settling for a life that is less than the one you are capable of living. And so I will pause there and open up to questions, comments, challenges. I'm very open to anything. Don't hesitate to bring difficult questions to me, and I'm really looking forward to engaging.
Thanks so much, Sneha. We are going to start with some of the pre-submitted questions. We'll spend about 10 to 15 minutes, depending how long it takes to move through them. And then you can put your hand up afterwards and Lal will find you and call you up for your questions. So I think, Pearl, do you want to go ahead and ask your question first?
Thanks. Thank you, Mandy. Hi, Sneha. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. My question is kind of like a personal question. You touched on it at the beginning of the session, and you spoke about, how difficult it is to navigate, especially through the pandemic, between your career and being a change maker, and also balancing your family. I just want to find out from your own personal experience if there are any tips that you can share, because I believe most of us on the call are young parents or parents to be, and we are on our 30s or 20s, and we're trying to fast track our careers and be recognized. And also in the same process, we're working from within our hearts to make sure that even the corporates that we operate in believe in the change that we are trying to drive. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And it's a really important question. I struggled with it for many years. Before I had my own children, I always used to think it was a trade-off, right? Like either you have kids or you have a career, and then you add in the social impact part to it, and it becomes almost impossible. And I have to say, I'm now 47, and I still feel there are days where I feel completely overwhelmed. And so I think the first thing is, you're not alone. It is overwhelming, right? Trying to do it all. I think it's a myth that we can do it all, but I think it's also not necessary to do it all. I think you can do a little bit of everything, and that's okay. But I think we have to be kinder to ourselves to say it's okay to let certain things go. So, if I want to show up and in sort of, my workplace, I might have to not be that great at making my kids dinner or snacks that day, right? Like there may be, or I might need to ask for help with some of that day. And but that doesn't mean I'm a terrible mother. It means that actually I've just had to compromise something at that point, and maybe then the weekend is where I get that back, where I actually spend time with my children and I really and I'm present. And I think that's one of the things I found as a great tool, is I've stopped thinking about my life as a series of like long tasks, and I've started thinking of my life as a series of present moments where I just really lean into in a period of time, and I'm fully present for the thing that I'm in. So I'm here with you guys right now. I'm fully present in this. And then, when I'm done with this, I will go and have lunch, and I'll make lunch for my children. I'll be fully present in that. And I'm not going to be with my phone or anything else during that time. And I think that is a healthy way to balance it, but also to be kind to yourself, to say, nobody is getting it all right. There's not a single person that I've known or I've seen that's getting it all right. Something is always dropping. It's just we're not always visible about what's dropping. So be kind to yourself and share with others, because you'll find actually everyone's dropping stuff all over the place. I've got like 800 unread emails right now that I'm just like, you know what, that's not my priority right now. I'll get to them when I get to them. And I need to be present right now in this conversation. But I think that's sort of the thing that I found helps me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Sneha is still very generous with her time and certainly helped me a lot when I added the extra work stream of a child. So thank you. And it's good to be honest, I guess, that you don't have it together all the time. So thank you for your honesty always. We're going to go on to, I think, Sim. Are you there, Sim?
I am. I didn't have a specific question, but I think just this moment of sort of like sharing and all of that, I think is just so helpful. I think acknowledging that we're not alone, and that there's multiple people sort of struggling with the same things, and you kind of think it's just you, and you're the one who can't juggle, you're the one who can't make the impact that everyone else is making. And as you say, I think people aren't good at sharing are the failures, or the times that like you don't necessarily have it together, or the times that you aren't able to be fully present with something. We're not good at sharing that, but we're very good at sharing like the successes and the highlights. So I think, sessions like this, to be able to have access to someone like you, and in the context of the group that we've got here, are so helpful. Because I think we're all on a mission. We all really want to feel like we've got purpose beyond just like our day-to-day job or whatever the case is. And we all are so passionate about making a change in the world. But sometimes it can get a little bit like overwhelming to think, well, exactly how? Like, am I able to make an impact? Like, how can I actually do something that is meaningful? Maybe I should just give up. It's so much easier to just say, oh, it's just too big. It's bigger than me. So I think things like this are really helpful and really inspiring. So thank you so much.
Oh, thanks, Simonetta. And one of the things I find is actually like, don't focus on the big changes. It's really hard, right, to shift a big rock that's standing in your way, but it's quite easy to chip away at it. And so if you can't shift the rock, like start chipping away. I have an example actually from the last 2 weeks. So we've just come together from Refinitiv and the London Stock Exchange Group. And so we've integrated 2 companies. And as the 2 companies have come together, we had been on such a great journey around empowering people and hearing the voices of young people. And then you have a big thing like this happens, and everything just goes top down again. And it's just hard, right? Because I'm like, part of me is like, are you joking? Like, we've just, like, and everything's taken a step backwards, from diversity initiative to sustainability to all the stuff that I care about. Like, and I get frustrated. And I was sitting in the group leader session last week, and I was trying to express this, and much of it fell on deaf ears, because most people are like sort of focused on like, we just need to get through this integration, we just need to close year end, like there's a lot of stuff we need to do. And I landed one thing. So I was talking about leadership as a bucket of rocks, and I said there's a Steve Jobs analogy which I've always loved, which is leaders aren't there to kind of just do their own thing and do them really well. They're there to kind of help polish each other. So this idea that a bucket of rocks actually creates friction, and when you rub it around, like the rocks basically bump up against each other, but they also polish each other, and that at the end of it, actually you will all come out better. And I said, can we not use this moment to really have constructive friction and bump up against each other and then polish each other? And I didn't land like 99% of what I was saying, but the word constructive friction really hit, right? Bucket of rocks and constructive friction became this thing that became repeated and repeated. And at the end of the 3 days of our leadership session, I was like, you know what, if that's the start, if that's the seed of like, we're going to have more open conversations in our group leadership team, that's cool. Like, I can live with that. And so, be okay with the seeds that you're planting and celebrate them. I think we also shouldn't just be like, oh, I didn't land anything. Like, look at the thing that you did land and just think about what that might grow into over time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. France. Is France there?
Hi, Mia.
Hi.
Said to remember to unmute. Yeah, so I think what I wanted to know is, throughout someone like you that has had an illustrious career, obviously there's been many challenges that you needed to overcome. And it would have been interesting for me to know sort of what was your biggest challenge during this time, and how did you actually go about to overcome that challenge?
Yeah, so it is, I mean, I think life is a series of challenges, and that's how we learn, and that's good. but when you're in the challenge, it doesn't feel like a learning experience. It feels horrible. so I think the one that Mandy slightly referred to it, but one that I felt very deeply and have really struggled with over the last few years was, I was, so maybe let's go back to 2012. I was in New York working for Thomson Reuters and telling everyone that my dream job would be to go work for Thomson Reuters in Africa, where I could really have social impact as well as business impact. And lo and behold, I said it in November, and there's probably a lesson in there about putting your thoughts out in the universe. I said it in November 2012, and February 2013, a job came up in Africa running our business, and I put my hand up, moved my family across, and sort of lived in Africa for 6 years and had the best and most amazing time of my life. It was like where everything just aligns. It was like the personal aspect of having my kids brought up in South Africa, which is one of my favorite countries in the world, being close enough to Kenya to go visit family, being able to travel and do wildlife and the stuff that I really love, having an impact in business where I was able to actually grow the business. I grew it from like 3% year on year to 14% year on year growth all organically, which was amazing. And working with governments and social enterprises and big companies to change what was going on in society, to actually talk about what does purpose-driven business mean, and how do we create more gender equality, and how do we create land rights, and like all of that came together. I was in my little bubble, loving life, right? And just thinking, I have really landed the sweetest thing. And every time my boss would be like, what do you want to do next? I was like, nothing. I am so happy. Like, I don't want to do anything next. I just want to continue growing this business and going as far as I can. And then in 2018, Blackstone bought Thomson Reuters, or half of the business. And my business got split in half. And Blackstone had recently been burnt in Africa. They had bought into a power business in Africa, Black Rhino, that hadn't done well for many reasons. But as a result, I was sitting in a world where I was sitting on the best story, the best growth story of all emerging markets in Thomson Reuters. But suddenly my business looked much smaller because it was only half the size. And I was talking to people who'd just been burnt on this continent and had zero interest in listening to my story. And what happened was I just kept fighting it. They wanted me to move to Dubai and run the business from there. And I was like, I think it's wrong. It's the wrong thing to do. I don't want to run it from Dubai. You have to run it from Africa. I had just created all these hubs, in Ghana and Nigeria and Kenya and Mauritius. And I was like, how would I, it goes completely against everything I've done. And so I had such a big internal battle. And in the end, it basically came down to me taking a flight to New York to try and negotiate my exit package, because I was just done. And when I was on the flight, it was funny. It was like one of those flights that had Wi-Fi. I got a call from one of the talent leads, and I'm literally sitting in this plane going to New York, crying to this talent person, saying, just stop. Like, I've had a great run with this company, but it's time to let me go. Like, I'm just done. I just want to have my exit package and I want to be done. And so she said, okay, do me a favor. There's like an exec I want you to come meet in the office when you land in New York. So I did. And sort of when I went in, this lady says to me, look, I know you don't know what you want to do next, but actually we need you to help with a business that we're struggling with. It needs turnaround. I know it's not what you want to do. It's not your dream job, but it might give you a landing cushion to actually think about what you want to do next. And so, because I was worried about my kids' schooling and how was I going to move the family from South Africa, and my visa had run out, I said yes. And that year gave me like real breathing room to do a couple of things. One is to accept the change. I think when you have these difficult moments, the first thing is to actually accept it's happening. And probably the most important thing, we often find we spend a lot of time going, it's not fair. Why did it happen? I still want to be there. And so my biggest lesson was to just accept it, and to sort of know that this was happening. The second was to say, okay, well, the dream was taken away from me, but actually the dream wasn't theirs to begin with, it was mine, right? Like, so how do I continue the dream from wherever I am? Because if I'm thinking Blackstone is determining my future, like I have zero control over that. But if I think it's my destiny and my future, then actually there's so much more I can do. And so I did two things. One is the people in my team, because that was something I hold very dear, and the talent. And I helped make sure that every single one of them landed well. Like, I went out of my way to make sure that people got connected to people in the industry, that people spent time with, they got the right mentors, that I was helping. And whether it was in the company or outside the company, I helped the people, because for me, that was the first thing. And then the second thing was I wanted to stay connected to Africa. So I started building those connections again. And I said, okay, well, how do I, if there's African entrepreneur groups, how do I stay connected to them? How do I stay connected to Mandy? How do I stay connected to some of my clients? How do I have regular coffees that bring me back into the space? And when the pandemic hit, it was fantastic for me, because suddenly everyone was remote and nobody was like, oh, you're in a different time zone. Everyone was like, oh, let's connect. And I started mentoring several African startups, and I'm now on the board of African Leadership Foundation. I'm on 2 advisory boards for African startups. And I'm also working on an accelerator program outside of work with Africa. And so, I think my dream didn't die, it just shifted. And that's what I would say is, like, I think to your question around what happens in difficult times, accept it and then actually take control of it. Because that's really the way that you can kind of go forward.
Thank you. That was awesome as always. Sneha, I wanted to ask, because you brought it up in that answer, but I know obviously you did a lot for gender within Thomson Reuters, and if you could just share some of that and your learnings, and why, how you motivated for women to really have a seat at the table. I think that'll be useful to the forum, because there is a team actually starting to work on that stream.
Yeah, so I've been involved with like the Women's Network at Thomson Reuters just as an employee network member, even from when I wasn't a manager, when I was just an individual contributor. And I would go to some of the meetings, and one of the things that used to really frustrate me, because of course I believe in gender equality, but I would go to these meetings and they would be like Excel classes for women, and they'd be advertised all over the building, and I would be like, oh, like you're just like telling everyone in the building that women don't know how to use Excel, and I would get so annoyed. And then I stopped going to some of the meetings because I didn't feel like they were engaging me. And the chairperson of the Women's Network in like 2010 came to me and said, why don't you take an active role? And I said, well, this is the reason why, because I just think that like you guys aren't doing what I think is needed. And she said to me, well, you can either sit on the sidelines and whine about it, or you can actually do something about it. And so, why don't you take up the challenge? And so I did. And she rightfully kind of chastised me, and I did. I got involved. I then ended up chairing the Global Women's Network, creating more chapters, shifting the focus from internal to external, really getting much more involved with our clients' Women's Network. And in the process, what I learned is a couple of things. When you make the case for these things that are obvious, whether it's racial equality or gender equality of any of these things, as much as it's obvious to you, it's not obvious to the other people in the room. And what ends up happening is you end up looking like an activist, and activists don't do well within large corporations, right? Because you look like you're trying to change the company in a way that they're not comfortable with. And so the first thing I learned was I have to speak in their language, right? Back to my earlier point. And so I started speaking about, I believe there's a connection between sort of more women in an organization higher up and company performance. And the more I was speaking about it, the more I was connected to other people that were also thinking that way, the more I was finding data that proved that, right? And within our organization, even we have a lot of indices, and I found that there was actually a team working on a gender index, on a diversity and inclusion index that was going to prove that point. And so starting to find that data to prove that point and make that connection, and then using that data to say, actually, this is why our customers care about it. This is why the market cares about it, because it will drive higher performance. And sort of looking at it from that lens, it completely shifted the conversation. And then even when you engage with the external, your clients or your suppliers, engaging with that lens really helped shift things. And then in South Africa, when I landed in South Africa, it was a mostly male leadership team, mostly non-African, which was like really entertaining. And so when I got there, I was like, okay, this has to shift. And I thought, well, if I try and force quotas on people, as much as, we've got all the B scorecards and everything else in South Africa, there's always, as a multinational, there's always a way that you can get out if you want to. And I didn't want to do that. And so I said, well, rather than having targets and scorecards, let's talk about what we're actually trying to do. We're trying to drive more diversity and inclusion because we want an agile business. So an agile business is one that actually will not go off a cliff. And I used the 2008 financial crisis to explain to senior leaders about, what happens when everyone has groupthink, right? Everyone goes off the cliff together. You need somebody in the room that's going to think differently to you in a volatile market. And so I used the idea of more diverse leadership team, but not a specific lens, not gender or race or anything else, but just I want more diversity of background. And we put in diverse candidate slates. We didn't change anything else, but we said we are going to force diverse candidate slates at every level in the organization. If there's an open position, you have to have 3 out of 5 of the candidates you look at have to be diverse. And diverse means not like the majority that you've already got. And so in Kenya, it might be a non-Kenyan, right? In Nigeria, it might be a non-Nigerian. And in South Africa, it might be someone who's sort of, at that time, the leadership team was very white. So someone who's not white and someone who's female. And we said that we would measure managers by how many diverse people they looked at, not by who they hired. So they could still, we didn't take away their power, right? Because if you take away their power, it's easy to make an excuse. The first time you get somebody who's diverse who fails, then the whole system falls down, because then it's like, well, I did try that and it was a failure. So don't take away the power from the managers. Let them have the power to hire who they want, but make them look. And so that's what we said to managers. We're going to judge you against how hard you looked, but you can hire whoever you want. And lo and behold, over time, we became the most diverse leadership team in South Africa for a multinational. And I can say that because we won awards for that. And we were 67% women, and we were every race and sort of persuasion that you can imagine under the sun. We had good representation of most diverse things. And it happened because we just like forced the diverse candidate slates. And so I think that's something is speak in the language that business understands, and explain why it's needed for a business purpose. And then, do something that's going to be a lever that you think will really change. For us, it was diverse candidate slates. For other people, it might be blind hiring. We've done other things like that over the years where we've learned, what really helps, but pick the lever and then really focus on it.
That's awesome. Really interesting. Thank you. There's one more question from Charles, who had to get onto another call, so I'm going to ask it. It's actually got 2. But the one is, what changes would you like most, what changes would you most like to be seeing made in business currently? And are there any facts that you think business leaders are currently missing? Yeah, so lots of facts that business leaders are currently missing. The world is shifting at a pace that most people don't even recognize, right? Like, I think if I sort of explain those trends to most CEOs, most of them would be like, oh, wow, like I kind of knew that was happening in the background, but I didn't understand, right? Like what is happening. And so I think I'll start with that is I do think that change creeps up on people. And so, no company wants to go bankrupt. No company wants to be irrelevant, but you become irrelevant because you're so focused on what you do well, that you forget to look at what's happening in the world around you. And so even there are some businesses within our business that when they do competitor analysis, they still look at the competitors they were looking at 10 years ago. And the world has changed. Like if you're in pretty much any business in the world, Amazon is going to be on your competitor list now, right? When it wasn't before. There's pretty much no business in the world where you shouldn't be looking at one of the big tech companies as your competitor, or partner. And actually customers are becoming competitors and partners right now. And so I think, there's a huge shift happening around that, which I think, business leaders who want to be agile, who want to be relevant, who want to thrive. And this is the right time to have a conversation with them, because they're all really thinking about this now coming out of COVID, is they really need to think differently, and they need to understand these big shifts. So that's what I would say is, if you are a change maker, bring that to their attention, because you'll be surprised how many people don't think about that. And then the sort of to the second part, or the first part of the question, which was what would I like to see done differently? So much, right? Like, I think I want businesses to move beyond carbon neutral to truly being sort of not just net zero, but actually stop polluting in the first place. Like create businesses that actually have that in their DNA, so that you don't have to fix the problem later. That's one big shift I'd like to see. I'd like to see some of the older people running the businesses getting out of the way and allowing some of the new people who are digitally native actually run the business. And because the world is shifting and it's so agile, that if you have, a 60-year-old who's never run a digital business trying to run the strategy, like, how are you going to figure that out? And not all 60-year-olds are like that, but there are too many like that. And so we need more young people actually just stepping up and saying, I actually do want to run that, and I've got a better strategy for that. In South Africa, actually, when I brought my head of marketing on the team, she had just turned 30, I think 31 or something. And everyone was like, you can't have her be the head of
Africa marketing for like a multinational. I was like, why not? She's a digital native. Like, she's amazing. And she won awards for being one of the top 10 digital marketeers in the world. Why wouldn't I want her on the team? And so, I think we have to get more young people on the team. And I would love to see just more of a sense of empowerment and belonging within organizations. Too many organizations are talking about the morale issues with employees in COVID and how, they really want to give employees flexibility. Well, how about you just listen to what employees actually want, right? Like, rather than sort of assuming that as a big corporate, that what they want is to work 2 days at home post-COVID, like, we don't know that. Like, everybody has a different need. Why don't we just listen more to employees and make them feel like they really belong and measure them on output rather than input? And that is a change I would love to see in business, is just give people a sense of like, good looks like this, figure it out, do it from wherever you want, however you want, and just give me the output. And I think we would be much more successful if we had that.
Awesome, thank you. I'm going to hand over to Lal so you can take some questions from the floor.
Lovely.
Thanks, Mandy. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to, any emoticon will do. So I think at the bottom, you'll find an emoticon if you don't mind pressing it, and we can switch over to you for questions. Let's start with Gugu.
Afternoon, Lyle. Afternoon, Sneha, and afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for just sharing your insights. I just have a quick one, which I'm hoping I picked up correctly in your opening statement at the beginning, where you spoke about how you've created the role that you're currently fulfilling. Well, did I hear you correctly there?
Yes.
So that's then really in essence my question. How have you managed to achieve that? Simply put, when we look at the spaces that you've been speaking about, of corporates that are slow to change, are not seeing the need for change, particularly if they're already ahead. In their view, I'm ahead of the curve. There's no way this is going to catch up. You've spoken very eloquently of the example of how if you don't have Amazon as your competitor, then you actually are, shall we say, not really understanding who you're really competing against. How does one actually go about almost trying to convince that mindset in corporates around, but actually you need to be seeing the world differently, that you need this kind of role players, stakeholders within your space. You cannot keep operating in the way you've previously have. And in turn, I or here's person X who can actually fulfill this type of role, which is maybe outside of the box of what you've considered. And also, I guess, the shift, out of one industry into another. And I think particularly coming from a female perspective, I've often found that industry tends to very much box you as this type of individual. And it's very difficult, again, talking from a female perspective, for them to actually see, but, how can you certainly contribute in this industry when you have you don't have the background, you don't have the impetus and so on, without actually even giving you a chance sometimes. So how did you actually be successfully, or how could you almost advise around those two challenges that we would come across?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Gugu. And I also liked your comment around sort of your dream didn't die, it multiplied. I thought that was really clever. So I think, so a couple of things. One is on the point around moving industries and people taking a chance on you. People will always take one chance on you. They won't take two. That's something that someone told me early in my career, and I really held on to it. So you have to build them the bridge, right? So when I was sitting in New York, I was working for a media organization. I knew nothing about our financial sort of business in Africa, and the role for South Africa was financial business in South Africa. So that was two jumps, right? Like in their minds, that was two jumps they were going to take on me. One was location and the other one was industry. And so I had to make it one jump, because otherwise they would find it really difficult. And so what I did was I called up some of my old contacts in South Africa and Kenya who I knew were in financial services. And I said, hey, would you be my references? I'm thinking of applying for this job. And, lo and behold, lots of the people I'd worked with earlier in my career as a trader were now heads of treasury and like in good positions in banking. And I said, will you be my reference if I go in for this job? And as part of my application, I put in, these are the types of connections I've got in financial services in South Africa, and here's why I know the Africa market. So the only risk you're taking on me is from media to financial services. You're not taking the risk on me around the continent, the knowledge of the continent. And that kind of worked. And so in my career, when I've looked back and I thought about where I've been successful and not, it's always when I've been successfully able to connect the dots for them as to why it's only one risk and not two. And so I think that's one thing. And then to your point around creating jobs, like find the people that believe what you believe within the organization and work with them, even if they're not the person that you want to change the mind of. So in my case, I wanted to create a role that was around starting and scaling new businesses for the company, because I believed that our company was too slow moving on that and wasn't able to start and scale new businesses effectively. And so, trying to talk to the CEO about that when he already had big divisions to run was not going to be effective. And so what I did was I looked around the company for who would think that way. And our group head of strategy is naturally someone who thinks that way, right? Because he's thinking about the future. And I sort of sat with him and I pitched to him and he was like, I really like that idea. But here's how I would do it. And I was like, well, I don't like the way you're thinking about doing it. How about this? And then he said to me, write it up for me. And so I wrote it up for him and I got him more comfortable with it to the point that he was able to then pitch it to the CEO and the CEO agreed and I got the job. And so, find those people. They're always there in the organization and just, go to them because they're already on the same train as you and it's much easier to go faster.
Thank you.
Perfect, great. Thanks so much, Gugu. Our next question, if I can hand over to Kagisho.
Afternoon, everyone. And nice now. Thank you for the presentation. Kagisho here from South Africa. And look, my question is actually education orientated because that's like my passion point, right? And that's what I'm involved in. And with you having worked in different parts of Africa and having a passion point for it, I would say, what are your thoughts as far as what else we can do to accelerate the adoption of alternative measures? And I'm just maybe I'm just too impatient because I am involved in the space, right? We've got a tech startup, it's doing very well, edutech, adoption is high, but what you tend to find is that the challenge doesn't necessarily come even from the end users, but it's structures, and yes, government has its own requirements and so forth, but I often worry about like what regulations put in place, how it slows that down versus the need and the accelerated rate at which we need to educate African children, because we do have the youngest continent. And I think we've got a 4 to 5 year window before these people become economically active. And COVID has actually exacerbated the situation. They're not going to build enough schools in that time. So what would you say are your thoughts and like, how does this happen? Because there are tech startups anyway, and I sometimes worry maybe we're not collaborating enough, but what would your thoughts be on how we can actually get this happening on a much bigger scale?
Yeah, I think this is something really sort of close to my heart as well, because I do think if we don't educate kids, then actually how are we going to solve for any of the problems in the future? Because Africa is the youngest continent and we're putting out the most people into the sort of workplace right now. And either it's going to be destructive, right? And they're all going to go towards crime and terrorism and all the things that we don't want them to, or it's going to be impactful for the world. So I think the first thing I'd say is like recognize there's a lot of players in this space and all of them have got slightly different but complementary solutions. So the faster you can go, to your point, the more you can partner, the faster you can go. I think there are some really interesting models around financing of students. So, where the blockers are is where you have to look, right? So if the blocker is financing, I think income share agreements are super interesting. And there are lots of private equity firms and venture capital firms that are interested in financing that because it has a real return for them down the road and they have the patience to do that. If it's around sort of actually what are we training the kids for, which I think is a big question. I think Africa is actually ahead of the US in that. Africa has so many models of training kids to be entrepreneurs, the ALA, the African Leadership Academy, and ALU, and that whole network is doing an incredible job at taking 13-year-olds and saying, we're going to help you build businesses before you turn 16. And if you can seed that in somebody and they've got a passion and a natural talent, that's your problem solved. They don't need to go to university, or any of that. Plus, I think as much as we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, not just in Africa, but everywhere in the world, tradespeople are going to be needed, right? Like you're not going to replace a plumber or a carpenter with technology and especially design, creativity. Those jobs are going to be really important. And so I think accelerating education is going to be around leaning into those three things. One is the funding model, one is around entrepreneurship, and one is around, you know, how are you training the skills of creativity and trades, because that's gonna make up for a lot.
Thank you. Yeah, that helps a lot, because look, we are getting traction, and sometimes I'm worried because I'm looking at the data. We've got lots of users. Like I've got 20,000 downloads every week.
Wow.
You know, of new learners in SA, and it's to say though, this is happening, but how do you optimize this? Because we only cater for high school, but how do I make sure that these kids are catered for even beyond metric, for example, and how do you even cater for lower grades? You know, and like there's so much more that other people can do, and it's just the fix. I'm like, okay, we got them there, but what's next?
So partner with them, but also, I mean, if you've got a successful model, like tell other people about it. Like go to like Duke or Harvard or any of these really amazing business schools that do these case studies, and ask them to do a case study on your business, because the more that the word gets out there that Africa's models are changing the world, the more that it will create more investment in that stuff, right? You think about what Flutterwave has done. Not only has it raised money for itself, it's created an environment where every mobile payments platform in Africa now has an audience. And so I think, you know, definitely get your word out there, because I think that's incredibly powerful.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Kahisho. Sneha, we're very conscious of time. We do have 2 more questions. Do you perhaps have another 5 minutes for us?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks. Nelly, I'm going to ask you to ask your question if you don't mind, and then we have another one that Sibasiso has just sent on private message. So I'll ask that one directly after Nelly's asked her question.
Cool.
All right. So thanks for that. I think I liked your last comment when you talked about you wish to see, I'm sure this was a question that was sent by somebody, but I liked the comment that you put forward to see young people playing and their voices being heard. But then I think the challenge that we have in organizations, it's that firstly, what if you are not even included in certain conversations that you know very well you could make a difference? And so how do you deal with that? Because I think some of these things are cultures that sort of are hard to change, and it becomes very difficult to sort of point your voice out. So I don't know how these things are done. I really like a lot of points you put, and I'm trying to just put them in one and sort of link it to this one.
Sure. So what I found in my career is when I'm not at the table, I create a different way to get at the table. So you know, right now I'm in a group strategy function with a business accelerator with 3 people, right? So I'm not at the seat of most of the decisions that are being made in the core business. And how do I get myself at that seat? It's by showing them something interesting that they didn't know about their business. So I will often send, you know, and I think so many people are open to that now with sort of the remote working environment. I will often send something that's like, hey, this is going on in your industry. Let me know if you want to have a chat about it. I know somebody who's in this space. And so create a seat that way. When I was more junior in my career, when I was a project manager and I didn't have any staff or any you know, ability to even speak to some of these the senior people, I got involved in the employee networks, because the employee networks were a way for me to create client events that then I would invite the CEO to say, hey, would you like to come and speak? We're doing a client event with Deutsche Bank. We're doing a client event with Citi. And would you like to come and speak? And so find a way to create space for you at the table with the stakeholders, even if your role doesn't allow you to.
Yeah, I actually like what you just said right now. And it reminds me of, possibly I've done this, of an experience I had in December, where our year end is December. So I'm quite involved in preparation of financial statements. So I usually like listening to the PricewaterhouseCoopers IFRS podcast. And one of the things that they were talking about on the podcast, and I was listening to this over the radio over Bluetooth, they were talking about how to include climate change in disclosures. We hadn't been discussing about this at work. And they were saying that if your year end is December, you will definitely have to put the disclosures because the auditors will ask you about it. So what I did is I just did a note to my manager to say we need to have this. And when the auditors came, they should have asked about it. And initially, the manager didn't put me as the lead on the climate change issue. But then when he realized that he's overwhelmed, he then routed it back to me because he realized that I had done so much work on it. So I think, yeah, maybe let me not put myself down too much. And I've done this before. I guess I didn't think about it the way you put it. So thanks for that.
You're welcome. It's amazing. And I think the other thing is, like, you may not have a platform in your company, but you have incredible voice outside the company, right? Like LinkedIn, Twitter, Clubhouse. like if you're passionate about that, host a conversation on Clubhouse about corporate disclosures, right? Like, and what is it going to mean, and bring in other people. And, you know, people will start paying attention when you have an outside voice.
Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thanks, Nelly. And Sneha, one last question from CBC is, what advice, or looking back, what advice would you give your 30-year-old self?
So people always ask me, like, sort of, do you regret anything, or would you have done anything differently? And I think this is probably a version of that. And although I've made many mistakes in my life, I always think that your journey is shaped by the things that you go through. And so probably, like, I don't know that I would have given any particular wisdom to my 30-year-old self other than trust the journey. I think no matter what journey you're on, just really trust it. Lean into the things that energize you. Lean out of the stuff that doesn't energize you. You know, all of us have stuff we don't like, but I'm not saying don't stop doing all your admin and stop doing the stuff you don't like, but don't spend as much time on it. Give your energy to the things that really energize you. And over time, that journey will unfold in a way that you can't even imagine today. So I think that's probably sort of like good advice for anyone at any stage in their career.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for the questions. But more importantly, Sneha, thank you so much to you. I think it's safe to say that we've all left inspired and with a renewed sense of energy. But even more for me personally, and I think for all of us on this call, it's so incredible to see leaders of your stature and someone of your caliber thinking about things in such a social, or at least socially conscious way. I mean, in terms of what we're trying to achieve from FinBiz, it's really good to see leaders that have a mindset of yours. And I think I just want to commend you on that. And I think it's something that we, as what I'd like to think our young leaders, can strive to be one day and look to follow in your footsteps. I just simply can't thank you enough for your time. And I know it's very busy and just kind of taking the time to speak to us. I think we all appreciate it more than you can imagine. And we couldn't think of anyone better to have kicked off this executive leadership session. So thank you so much for that. If I can ask everyone first to switch on their cameras now, if you don't mind grabbing a screen grab picture or a COVID sensible picture for all of us, if everyone can just turn on their cameras for a couple of seconds.
That would be amazing. And while everyone's doing that, I just want to say thank you, first of all, just really for having me at the session. This is the sort of stuff that really does energize me. And Mandy knows that, which is why she invites me to kind of stuff like this. But also, you know, when I think about what I learn most when I'm around people like you. The reason I go to One Young World, the reason I'm so energized by it is because I just am blown away. And I haven't even heard like a tenth of your stories yet. But, you know, the difference you're making in the world is kind of what keeps people like me energized, because I feel like, you know, I'd like to have impact, but I actually look at the stuff that you're doing and I'm just like, I don't even know how you guys do it. So keep going and well done.
Thanks so much, Sneha. I think, Mandy, we're going to take a screen grab and I'll have a countdown, 3, 2, 1, and everyone can give a bit of a wave.
Cool. You go ahead. Will you do it on your side?
Cool. Okay. 3, 2, 1. I think it's safe to say pictures during COVID are very awkward, but say again, thank you.
They are.
And I think from our side, if we can embrace Moore's law and double our processing power and find more effective and efficient ways to do that as FinBiz, I think we'll be doing a great job. Thank you so much and appreciate your time.
I know, anytime, and thank you guys, and love to connect on LinkedIn or any other social network that you guys are on. Okay,
perfect.
Thanks.
You,
Bye.
Bye.
Everybody else can, if you don't mind.
Cheers.
Wait, everybody else wait.
Oh, okay.
Everybody else. Yeah, so I think what we want to do next is have a bit of a breakout session. So we've organized some breakout rooms. The purpose of that is just to get to know a little bit of people that you don't usually interact with. I see we've got some people from the Irish task force and some people from the South African task force, and it'll be great to have a little bit of a catch up. So I think the purpose of the breakout sessions is just to have a bit of a chat about what you're working on, the projects that you're working on within your task forces, and if there's an element of collaboration that can be had post those conversations, even better. If you don't mind staying on after those breakout sessions, we'll come back into the room and just do a bit of a wrap up after that. So in a couple of seconds, you'll probably,
Lyle, I'm so sorry, guys. I need to run. I'm actually late for a 5 p.m. with my team. Actually, we're testing the web version of that platform. So I sadly need to run, and thank you for this, but I'll catch up. Men's, we can set up a call as well.
Cool.
Sorry, guys.
Thanks. Cheers. Good luck.
Sorry. Bye.
If you don't mind just accepting, you'll probably get a notification to accept breakout rooms. Have a bit of a chat to some people on the call, and we can go forward from there. To everyone, but thank you so much for joining us as well.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I have really enjoyed this session so much. I mean, that speaker was quite something. I was just talking to my group. The way she's able to connect to people both emotionally, so intellectually and emotionally, it's a very, very rare thing to find. She's pragmatic. She gave really useful advice, not just platitudes and nonsense. She really says, and this is how I did it. And I think that encapsulates, you know, the ethos of this group, you know. And so thank you so much, Mandy and Lai, for organizing it. I think this could be a great model for more to come, not just in South Africa, but in other task forces. Thank you for inviting me to attend. I really, really have enjoyed it. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, and again, thanks to everyone for joining. I won't keep you any longer. Have great weekends. Be safe, and we'll see you on the next call.
Wonderful.
Speak soon. Bye.
Bye. Thanks all.
Bye.